parts here. So a little bit about myself. I got started out in the airline industry, started out actually in FP&A, so did a lot of forecast budgeting, variance analysis. So shout out to all the FP&A folks out there. Then I got into software in the early 2000s, back in the on-prem days, worked my way up through FP&A to SaaS CFO at founder private equity-backed businesses. And needless to say, have been through quite a few budget seasons. So great to be here.
Yeah, I think we got our 10,000 hours or more kind of similarly, FP&A route. So I started out on the consulting side of things. I was in private equity for a couple thousand cups of coffee. And then I realized that, building companies was a lot more fun. And so I made the switch over to the operator side and like Ben, worked my way up within the FP&A group to eventually become a CFO. And now I'm pretty obsessed with, how companies allocate their resources and plan for the year ahead. So this will be fun. So I think at the heart of any good planning season are solid building blocks. Similar to how you don't want to build a house upon sand, you want to make sure that you have data from the beginning that will give you actionable insights. This is something that I think I have come to appreciate more and more the more seasons that I've gone into, where I'll rush into the planning season about what I want to do next year, but I don't have a solid foundation to build upon. So we listed out a couple building blocks here that we like to collect. You may be using an FP&A tool. You may be leveraging Maxio. You may be leveraging an ERP. Hopefully it's not on a piece of paper somewhere. But the building blocks that I usually take down are the current headcount roster, the open headcount roster, and the open here. I'll just quickly explain that there's something pretty nuanced about this that you want to get right. So when you speak about open headcount, you want to talk about the heads that are currently being recruited for. So actively trying to bring people into the building. Recruiters are being tasked to go and find those people. And then heads that were approved for this budget season, but you're not acting on them yet. If you don't get that last group, sometimes headcount and how you kind of tally them up can slip through the cracks. Then you want to go over the September P&L. And we say September because, Ben, we're here, late August. Usually September is where I draw the line in the sand. Maybe you'll debate it's a different month, but that's why we have 3 plus 12 here. It's really 15 months, 3 months left in this year, plus 12 more months, 15 months. The historical sales rep attainment. So how are you actually doing on kind of an individualized basis in hitting the top line goals? And then LTM costs. Ben, what are some of the building blocks that you look to incorporate when you kick off this process?
Oh, definitely along those same lines. Definitely the headcount roster. I mean, people, especially in tech and SaaS and software, people make up most of that investment and that spend. So we've got to nail that. And like you said, the open headcount. And if you're working at really large companies, thousands of employees, sometimes we have open headcount assumptions, right? We're not just budgeting to full headcount capacity. So, and CJ, a question that comes up from founders all the time is, I talk 9A plus 3F, right? That's 9 months of actuals, 3 plus 3 of forecast, which you mentioned. So 3 of forecast there. And usually, that seeds the variance analysis, which we'll talk about, that 9A plus 3F plus next year's budget. And like you said, that is probably every FP&A's kind of nightmare, is like we start, the budget season is dragging on, and oh boy, now they want us to update, the 10 plus 2. Now we've got to do all those variance analyses, those explanations over again. And of course, those costs. So, and of course, the revenue side, go to market motion, pipeline, bookings, all that stuff, which we'll talk about again. But yeah, those are those major inputs, plus just non-wage stuff, right? Not just people, but do we have training? Do we have events, that we have to budget that we can't just necessarily trend, like say telecom expense?
And I want to say at the beginning that like every budget is technically wrong. Like you will never hit it to the penny, but how you hedge your bets in getting it more correct is the headcount piece. Had Bennett alluded to it. I mean, if 75% of costs walk on 2 legs, and then you're also forecasting a lot of your indirect costs based on that headcount, that's where you really want to sharpen your pencil and get it right. And Ben, I had never heard of it called 9 plus 3. What did you call it? 9?
Yeah, 9A plus 3F. Maybe it goes back to my airline lingo days, but
no, I love it.
Plus 3, yeah.
And the 3 piece that has kept me up at night as an FP&A person, because I am like that. It's put your money where your mouth is. You're essentially not gambling, but you're trying to really predict how the rest of the year is going to go.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a big deal, and really refining that. I think, man, I don't know, we have an upcoming slide on that, but that three portion of the forecast so important because again, that's setting the foundation that you're building upon for next year's budget.
Absolutely. So let's talk about tops down target setting. This term is thrown around a lot, and I'll admit, I was a bit of a poser, I think, when I started in FP&A because I'd use like tops down, bottoms up, and I was just like budgeting. It was kind of one budget, and it didn't really become two kind of lenses or views of the world until I kind of matured in that career. And so the way that I look at a tops down target setting is kind of who picks the first number. I always think of that Spider-Man meme where it's like the three Spider-Men like pointing at each other. Someone has to draw a line in the sand and pick at least one number to start, and usually it's the CEO and CFO. And so the three targets that I usually look to just to get this thing going are revenue growth, productivity, which is usually some form of how many heads do we have on board versus the expenses or revenue that we expect to have in the building, and then profitability, which is, are we going to burn cash or are we going to make money next year?
Yeah, definitely. I think, in tops down, bottoms up, really we have to start somewhere. And like
Yeah.
you said, revenue, we need to know that plan for next year because our leaders who are going to help us in the budgeting process, they need to know how to allocate resources. What do they need to hit those targets, whether it's bookings, revenue, profitability, gross profit, EBITDA that we're after. And I like, an airline industry analogy was we didn't know what to budget yet. We need to know how many aircraft are flying, how much are they going to be flying? Otherwise, like how many pilots, flight attendants do we need? We don't know. Same thing in technology and in SaaS and software. We need to know where the business is going. So then when we talk to our leadership team, they know, okay, how many heads do I need? What kind of productivity do I need to budget for or achieve? And that just helps them in the planning process. Otherwise, we're just budgeting blindly.
And so to get a bit more specific on what goes into this tops down target setting, because you're not just picking a number out of a hat, right? Like you do have historical information and hopefully you are doing some sort of long range forecasting. So it's not like it's a surprise, like, next year, it's 40 million. It's like, well, you probably know it's somewhere between 38 and 42 million. And now this is where you're trying to get more specific on what that like landing area is going to be. And so the required decisions that you hope that are going to fall out of this tops down target setting exercise are like a target P&L. And this doesn't mean your entire P&L is baked. It means like this is what we want to look like financial profile wise. You want your top line sales target. So like I said, if you're somewhere between 38 and 42, maybe now you're talking around a number that's closer to 40 or 41. So you're starting to get more specific there. And then the comp structures. How are you actually going to incentivize people to go out and sell stuff? Are you going to do 6-month comp plans? Is this like a macro environment where you don't feel all that confident in doing a full year, quota assignment? What's that going to look like? I also like to do a post-mortem on the past year. This is where you should be honest about what worked and what didn't work, because you don't want to go just rolling forward some of the same assumptions on maybe the competitive environment or how fast or slow you brought products to market, because that'll impact how you think about the next year as well. And then we have a slide on this 2025 global priorities. So in my opinion, priorities should come from the CEO, and kind of that cascades down and sets the tone. Anything you'd add on this tops down exercise, Ben?
Yeah, CJ, you mentioned something important, that long-term planning, because I've done that in larger companies where we go through in the summer before we even get to budget season, a 3-year strategic planning process. And like you said, that kind of sets those high-level targets, say for if we had just completed that right now for 2025, 2026, 2027, revenue, bookings, maybe profit, EBITDA, et cetera. And that kind of shapes, then that helps us provide some guardrails a bit of what we're trying to achieve now for 2025. It doesn't give us the exact details, but at least it puts a ballpark out there. So I think really important if you're getting to that stage, where you're bringing that team in, maybe you have some board input, and that just, I think it helps that, even though it's extra work, a lot of work creating that long-term forecast, I think it then helps shape the next budget season a little bit better.
Yeah, and the way that I do my annual planning and even my monthly and quarterly planning is it's all within a larger model, right? Like I'm not as convinced about the out years, right? But it is flowing through, so I always have some sort of long-term format that I'm referencing.
Right. Yeah. Because, and I don't know if you're, yeah, like you have different forecast models, but usually
Yeah,
for me, it's like one forecast model that maybe we just carry out farther and we're not really getting into all those nitty gritty details every single head, but more macro level assumptions that drive that forecast. And part of that, kind of part of that same exercise.
totally. All right, so this is just an example of a what worked, what didn't work in the past year. And so what I like to do is go through with the CEO. And so I'm coming at this from a perspective of a CFO, right? So I'm just trying to get onto paper our reactions of what worked and what didn't work in the past year. Um, Ben, do you like to have an honest assessment going into planning season, or is this too philosophical? What's your opinion here?
I think, you mentioned that post-mortem. I think that's good, getting, huddling with your FP&A team of, yeah, what could be done better? Was it technology? Is it how we communicated the timelines, the reviews? Because it is a very complicated process. And I'll tell you, CJ, what makes me the most nervous as a CFO is
Yeah.
January variances. That's like true test. Like when you go in, you close January books, compare that to budget, like, oh boy, I hope I didn't make a mistake or there's an Excel error or something like that, where you miss like a benefits assumption or something that drives this huge variance right from the start. That I'd say top CFO nightmare right there.
I that's the inside baseball I think that people are here for, because I've been on the edge of my seat like when the January results roll in, because that's essentially like, did I do this whole thing
Hmm.
right? And you're holding your breath.
Exactly. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but yeah, it's good. Yeah, budget see, just like going through audit, right? You learn something every time, you improve your process every time, and budget season is no different.
You cut me deep, Ben. About 4 years ago, I got the benefits assumption wrong by like 15. It should have been like twice as much as it
Mhm.
as it was, and I knew on February 1st that I was in for a rough year for that line.
Oh yeah, I've had a few where you start sweating, that's for sure, and then your CEO is like, "What, Ben? What went wrong here?" And now we've got to explain that for the full year.
Yeah, yeah, 11 more of those. Always fun. Um, Global priorities. Someone once said to me that when you do priorities, you either have to have three or five. It's awkward if you have four. I don't know. Mount Rushmore's four heads on it, but go figure. Global priorities for the next year. I think that it's important to write these out because the departments should have derivative goals and some semblance that tie back to them. So even if I'm in finance and there's a product related goal, there is something that I can do to help them allocate resources more efficiently to get there. I think it also forces people in different departments to think outside the box and to feel like this is a team effort in accomplishing the goals, right? You're not just working within silos. We have these global priorities that all have some sort of derivative that you can tie back.
Yeah, I think this is really important. We talked about kind of tops down and target setting that helps guide us for the budget. But then there's only so much capital that goes around, right? CJ, we get all those requests from all the department leaders. I want heads, resources, training, et cetera, go to conferences, new software, but there's only so much capital, right? And that's where we have to work with, say, our board, our CEO, executive team. What are our priorities for next year strategically? What are we trying to achieve here? Is it more efficiency? Is it more profit? Is it growth? And that then helps us as CFOs shape that budget. Because again, when I get the department templates back, CJ, I knew some things they just weren't going to make the cut. Or we were going to go from nice 10, 20% EBITDA margins down to negative 20, right? That's not going to work. So as a CFO, I was actually reviewing all that stuff and like, hey, this makes sense to get in the budget. This doesn't, or these are discussion items. And that gets back to priorities. What are we trying to achieve next year? And then what are the financials saying about that?
I've actually pulled this up a few times in discussions, say mid-year, with different department leaders who are asking for allocation in the budget for something new that we didn't agree to do. And I think the hardest thing of running a company is saying no to things that are good ideas on paper, but you have to remember, like, hey, we all agreed as a group, these are our priorities. If we do that, then we're not going to be able to do this. Do you still think these priorities hold? And I think memorializing this as a group at the beginning of the year gives you a conversation point to come back to.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think we talk about maybe priorities, but yeah, you're right. Putting it on paper, then because it's easy, 6 months later, 7 months later, 8 months, like what was that assumption in the budget? What were we trying to do with that? And we don't have that good documentation then.
All right, so bottoms up target setting. Um, this is where the rubber hits the road, right, Ben? This is the good stuff. And so, what you want to get right here, I think, to start, and Ben hit it on it earlier. Like the majority of the costs are headcount. The direct costs are a very large component of this. So you're going to want your current headcount, your new head count. I like to phase that by month and quarter. And then what I like to give out is a max, or work towards with department leaders, is a max head count envelope. So the max is like the theoretical most heads you should have at any point within the department, right? And that helps because I've fallen into the trap before of giving out incremental heads, like, hey, product department, you get 6 more heads. And then you got backfills, you got some open head count that didn't get filled from the prior year. And there can only be so many parking spots really within the org. So if you deal with max head count, that gives you a backstop to talk, to basically catch all the other derivatives of how people move in and out of the org.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, the head count, benefits, taxes, bonus, commission, such a big piece of the budget. And we've got to nail that current headcount roster, plus working with all our department leaders who are helping us with the budget. Again, going back to our priorities, back to our targets, that they can then say, hey, if I want to hit, that 10 million bookings target and the resulting service hours work, et cetera, this is what I need. These are the headcount that I need. And then they have them go through like a little mini justification of why that makes sense. Then of course CJ CFOs, we layer this all in, and then see where the dust settles to see what makes sense. So the headcount in those discussions so important, because it's easy to add a ton of headcount, and then going back and just unwinding that is hard, or it prolongs the budget process.
Yeah, and this is a term that I stole from somebody a long time ago, so you can steal it from us too, but it's the concept of a budget envelope, right? I think that people inherently think that budgeting is like, oh, you're putting like these guardrails on me, or you're putting handcuffs on me. But if you say like, I'm giving you this budget envelope, it empowers them to think, oh, this is mine that I can work within. And I feel empowered to go out and spend it on the right things. I don't know, Ben, if you've ever relied on kind of ways to phrase it to people to make them feel like this is their budget. It's not like I'm trying to hold you down.
Yeah, I think it has to be their budget. We can't dictate it to them. But I think sometimes what I experience with, say, managers, directors, VPs who have not been through many budget cycles, or it's the first budget, they kind of need some help on sizing sometimes. Yeah. Just give me some parameters here so I don't go crazy or don't do enough. And a great example, like I love, the cost of ARR in SaaS, right? Or the SaaS CAC ratio, because, if we're spending 10 million on sales and marketing, well, should we book 10 million of net new ARR? So it's like kind of those parameters that help us, especially working with sales and marketing where there's a lot of investment. If our bookings target next year is, like I said, 10 million, and we're going for dollar cost of ARR, well, CRO, roughly your budget's going to be around $10 million if that's the ratio we're going for. So sometimes it just helps them in that process.
Yeah. You got to give them the tools to understand how you're pulling this together. I love those like tricks of the trade that you're referencing. It's kind of like you help them sanity check it along the way.
Yeah.
All right, so we covered the direct cost, majority of the dollars, but you can also use that to forecast, I think, a lot of the indirect costs. So I'll throw out some indirect costs here, and we call them indirect because it's non-people related. Some people just call people costs, non-people costs. But you have software, professional services, or contractors. Contractors piece, we could talk about that all day if that's really in the other category of this one. Travel, training, and then shared corporate overhead. Ben, what would you pick out here to talk to?
Yeah, and like I said, I call this non-wage expense. So we can't forget those big categories. Back in the day where we used to spend millions of dollars on travel, maybe a little bit different, but yeah, what I call internal use software, right? We're using Salesforce, HubSpot, Maxio, whatever it might be. We get that budgeted by department, because that does become a big bill, as we know. And contractors, let's not get those lost and plug them all in G&A. They've got to be budgeted by department, another big expense. Training, and then what else? Payment processing fees, just different things that we have to hit on, to make sure they scale correctly in the budget. And then corporate overhead, if we have IT, if we're allocating rent, different things like that. But just think about those big non-wage expenses: training, internal use software, events, conferences that we may, that we get right. And then the other stuff, I like internet, telecom, usually I can trend those pretty reasonably,
Yeah.
unless something weird is going on. So I don't need like every single penny built up from the bottoms up, but just those things where the leaders have some influence and control over discretionary spend. You do need their input there.
Ben, you'd said it to me when we were preparing for this. Like, there's a lot of stuff in here that you can essentially roll forward, right? Like,
Mhm.
Maxio, if we're using that, it's probably not going away next year, right? We're going to renew or we're on a multi-year contract or something. I can include that in my forecast for next year. It's not like every department, so you don't have to get nervous that like I have to do this buildup of every single thing in there. It's not like you're building every department, like the marketing department from scratch each year. Like you do know a lot of these vendors.
Right. Yeah, right. That's where I can help with the budget. Like, hey, leaders, don't fret over every single expense that's
Yeah.
running through your department. I can find those, and then maybe we have a discussion if something's going to change. But yeah, that just helps them where they can really focus on those strategic expenses, resources, investments that they need to put in.
Ben, and any tips or tactics for budgeting? I'll give you two to choose from, either travel or training.
Ooh, yeah, travel. I like actually travel. I like to build that from the ground up. So it depends on our go-to-market model, right? If we are going out into the field selling big enterprise deals, I think we're going to share this after the webinar. Is I have a travel template that builds it up. How many reps do we have? How much are they traveling? Is customer success traveling? Services traveling? Maybe that's a bill back. So if travel is an important part of your go-to-market motion and your service model, I do have my leaders build that from the ground up. Otherwise, it's one that kind of you can't trend because it changes year to year.
On the travel one, I try to break it into sales related costs or revenue driving travel and internal costs. So like finance team, I'm probably not traveling to go out and close deals, but I probably do meet with my team, twice a year in person, and I know that to a certain degree. I like, Ben, how you were able to link it back to, though, like the atomic unit, which is like a rep. How many times are they going to travel per year per deal? That's great.
And then, yeah, CJ, I don't know if you want to take a question right now, but maybe we can do a quick question here. We
Yeah.
have a question from Usha. So, how do you estimate the raises for existing headcount? Great question. I've seen that at the time of budgeting, sometimes standard 3 to 4%. I keep getting requests, to see if we can squeeze in more budget dollars from elsewhere to give higher raises. Okay, we could talk about that for a while. So, any thoughts on just the proper amount, CJ, to budget for merit raises, CPO, inflator on wages?
So I do it. So I come out to 1% that I plug in, but it may be I'm assuming 5%, and within that, 3% is for, I'm making it up here. 3% is for like standard cost of living that I assume across the board, and then 2% on top of that is for promotions. So I want to have it broken out so I can help leaders say this amount here is for people who are getting promoted and going to a different role versus this amount here is more like the run rate, but it equals 5%. I'm also going to admit that I always do throw in an extra 1% at the end of this budgeting to have in my back pocket because I know inevitably somebody's going to come back and need some more money from me. What do you think,
Yeah.
Ben?
Well, yeah, that's the back pocket fluff that CFOs don't talk about. So, but yeah, I think, it depends. Like big company sizes, it's pretty ruthless, right? We are told that, hey, merit, the whole pool is 3%, budget that. You send the templates out to your department leaders, and you've got to come back to that 3%. Maybe it was $100,000 of merit, and you've got to allocate that to your employees. And sometimes, it's just black or white. But then that comes up where, working with my, dev leader, it's like, hey, this person really, they're doing great. We need to increase them. That always comes up, and we have to be careful because then it's easy for our budget to get out of control. And those are where, those are discussion items where, all right, we try to stick to that merit pool, but then, maybe I'll go to my CEO and it's like, hey, here are some exceptions that we're looking at, and get some feedback from the CEO there. But we do have to ballpark that overall merit pool, if that's 500,000 for next year, just to make sure all of a sudden it didn't go up to 600, so you do have to manage it carefully. And sometimes you have to be a little ruthless with it.
Yeah. Yeah, but generally the org should have a philosophy of like, hey, we generally pay at the 50th band or something like that, or 60th band, and then there should be a number that you've probably relied on in the past, a
Yeah.
ballpark number.
Oh yeah. See, great point. That's a whole nother thing, right? It's like, hey, we're not Google. Maybe we're a $20 million AR
Yeah.
company, right? We can't compete with Google. That's just not who, we can't do it. So there's just those conversations too of just, I think, and with your HR leader, just general wage and benefit philosophy. If we have to let certain people, we can't hire those people because it just doesn't fit with our overall framework.
Hey, this isn't this question reminded me, but it's related to indirect costs. Ben, do you pencil in a percentage uplift for cost increases to current software? Like, do you put in like 2 or 3% for software increases?
I think, it depends. It just depends like how big the budget is, how big of a company we're budgeting in. But I think that's fair. You do have to consider just general inflation that we don't
Yeah.
that, and that could get to our little fluff category in some areas, the back pocket. But I think that's good because that's just like if you're a huge company, open headcount assumptions, right? If you miss that, that's a big deal. So yeah, I think, with the materiality, but yeah, it could be a good idea to put that in.
I messed up last year on this one. Salesforce put in like a 5% just across the board increase. I did not have it in my budget.
Yeah, that's where that adds up if that's happening throughout your company. Yeah.
And keep the questions coming. That was a great
Yep.
one.
Yep.
All right, so this is just an example of something that I would pull for, say, my engineering leader here. And you may be using an FP&A tool, so you don't have to do it there. But I just wanted to show you in a slide format kind of the information I'd want to give them to feel grounded in how we're going about this. So usually what I'll do is I'll pull the software spend that's rolling into their department currently. Like Ben said, you have stuff that you know that you're going to use next year again, right? It's not going to go away. So you can give them the baseline of how much they spend. Contractors, please do not lose sight of this. This is like the flex capacity that you have for special projects or for outsourcing stuff. I try to work with leaders to say, hey, man, we don't know everything that's going to happen next year, but we probably are going to launch a new product. Why don't we put in $10,000 per month? We'll just, we'll earmark it for contractor spend next year. And then we talked about headcount before, giving them some of the numbers on how they scaled it in the past year.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have to give our leaders just something. Some leaders want, hey, give me all my transactions and I need to know kind of what's flowing through my department. So just some reference, some data, sometimes we'll just download those transactions, try to pivot it by vendor, just different things just to give them some idea of all those expenses flowing through their department, just more data and insight that will help them refine their budget so they're not just guessing blindly.
We got another one, good one here. Tom P said, love the transparency. I bury dollars all over the budget. I'm not the only one. For the inevitable need for more money, probably 1% of annual spend. What is the right amount of buffer? Is this self-perpetuating behavior? Ooh, Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, you have to be careful. I think sometimes we know, right? We've been through budgets enough where maybe it's not just a plug, like, it's like, hey, plug sales, and I just have a plug, and that's what it says in the spreadsheet. But I think sometimes maybe certain categories, maybe we add a little bit more than we think, and also that gets back to like, where's the budget trending? Is it in good shape where we have a little bit more room to add a little fluff in certain areas where it's just not obvious? But yeah, we have to be careful, right? Because last thing we need is the board CEO, like we miss it, right? We want to be close, right?
Yeah.
Of course we want to exceed plan, but what if we exceeded plan by a huge amount? That's still, that looks bad on the CFO.
Right. Either way, good or bad, if you're like
Yep.
way over, it just means
Yep.
you don't know the direction of which way the ship is going. But I will admit, Tom, that something I do is with headcount assumptions, I let people be a little over optimistic of when they think they'll hire a person, because I inevitably know it may be 2 weeks, a month, 2 months later. And that ends up being actually my cushion, that it always takes longer to hire people than you think.
Yep.
And I'm not going to put everybody on January 1st, but like if the engineering leader thinks that he's going to have 4 more people in March, in my head, I know that it's probably going to be March, April, May, June, one in each month. And I eat up that buffer.
Yeah, definitely headcount is the one we never hire as fast as we think we will.
We talked about this before, but what worked last year, what didn't work? I have the department leaders fill it out too for an honest assessment. You should probably have the C-suite come together at some point and go through this together, kind of get everything on the table, direction you're going for next year. Departmental priorities for 2025. It doesn't always have to be like one for one back to the CEO of what they laid out, but it should be able to tie, to the org's overall goals. And like I said, even if you're in finance, you should have a way to impact, say, the R&D goals, the HR goals, the recruiting goals, things like that.
And we have a CJ, great question from Monica. How do you handle leaders who want to get super granular with the budget and it slows down the budget process?
Yeah. It's funny. There are like two types of leaders. The ones who it's kind of hear no evil, see no evil, where they just want it to be like really high level and not dig in, and you're kind of doing it for them. And then others that want to go down to the penny, which can actually slow you down quite a bit. I think what I tell people is that I want to be honest that this is directional in the sense that I'm trying to land a plane on kind of a moving air carrier at sea, right? I want them to understand that we're trying to predict something that's moving here, and it's degrees of getting it correct. And so what I try to do is I don't let them get down to specific like numbers, like this salary is exactly 93,000. We usually set ranges for it, and then it gives me the autonomy to go back in the model and set the final number. So you have to remember that the input you asked them for, you at the end of the day can go back and say, all right, I heard this, but I really think it means that, and then put it into your model. Ben, how have you dealt with that scenario?
Yeah, for me, forecasting budgeting, it's an 80-20 rule, right? Just enough detail to make the forecast budget accurate. And also think about variance analysis year over year. So enough detail that we can provide good variance explanations, because we don't want just these generic buckets in the budget that then we go to explain the variance. We're like, well, I'm not sure what was in that.
Yeah.
So enough detail where we can really provide some performance analysis. But again, it's that 80-20 rule, just enough to be accurate, enough detail for variance analysis. So it's great that they're into the details. But again, I think that's where we have to also coach those leaders.
And something I also say to them too is, hey, man, I'm not going anywhere. Like I'm going to talk to you at the end of each month about this, right? Mm-hmm. So don't feel like this is speak now and forever hold your peace. We're going to work together throughout the year. That's been the biggest thing I think to get somebody like who's stuck moving in the right direction. Like, hey, we're putting our best foot forward here. I'm going to take you through where you're at and what you have left at the end of each month. All right, the timeline. Dun, dun, dun. Ben, you want to hit this one first? Some of the inputs?
Yeah, some of the inputs. And then, we had that timeline. But again, generally, I think about budget season really kicking off October 1st, if we're in the calendar fiscal year. That's my heads down time, getting the templates out to leaders, getting all the inputs, creating that draft, hopefully, having a nice draft early November, having that time, then probably late November, meet with my CEO, have a review there. Then that could create another draft. And then we try to lock it in early December. So then, of course, 1 to 2 weeks of preparing those budget slides, which take a ton of time, and then presenting to the board later in the year. And again, major inputs, we kind of addressed this already, but if we're in software SaaS, the pipeline, those bookings targets, those high level targets that help us resource plan. And CJ mentioned, headcount roster, all those assumptions on headcount benefits so important, the hiring plan coming from our leaders, and then recent trends, right? Retention, we're health of our recurring revenue, what's our GR looking like, NRR, customer retention, that helps firm up our revenue forecast. And then CapEx, you don't see that as much now in software and SaaS, but if we do, if those expensive Apple laptops that the engineering team,
they are expensive. I got a Lenovo. I didn't get one.
I got my PC. So, but CapEx, just make sure we're doing depreciation, amortization right. Do we need to capitalize R&D? What's our process for that? Then the non-wage. So just at a high level, thinking through those big inputs that really move the budget.
Ben, I'm really glad you brought up timeline. A mistake that I make it every year. I give all the department leaders ample time to give me inputs, but I give myself very little time to do the roll up and then sit with it after. So I'll give myself like basically 48 hours, and I should be like sitting back with it and going through it with a fine tooth comb before I have to present it back to my CEO. So typical finance person, leave time for yourself.
Yeah, and depending on the company size, usually I give my department leaders 2 weeks. Right? They've got the targets now. You've got the templates. You've got 2 weeks to get me back your first draft.
We did have a question come in around software-wise. Any
Hmm.
suggestion on amortizing prepaid software? How do you handle that year over year?
Well, I mean, prepaid's like assuming you are like that big Salesforce bill for 100,000 or two hundred
Yeah,
thousand, right? Goes to prepaids, and it's just part of your
I just
budget.
let it go forward.
Yeah, yeah. So it's identifying that, just making sure we have good tracking of that. So I'd say just normal part of the process. And also, are you on cash basis or you accrual? How are
Mm,
you putting this into your budget? That can have an impact. So, all right. So we talked about budget inputs. And the big thing I find with SaaS and software, depending on size, like headcount, we nailed that, nailed the non-wage, but a lot of time is spent on the revenue models, and forecasting revenue correctly. And, we have to figure out, do we want to do this by product line? How do we manage our revenue streams? Do we have major product lines, verticals? So we have to figure out, because that dictates how we're setting up all those revenue tabs, at least of my forecast model. And one thing that definitely helps SaaS is that MRR waterfall. And I've used Maxio for some clients, where what we do is we pull out the subscription momentum report, and really what I call that the MRR waterfall. So you can see that screenshot, opening, new, lost, expansion, contraction. You can drill into that, but that's just that necessary data that makes our budget that much more accurate. From that MRR waterfall, the customer waterfall, we can calculate customer retention, gross revenue retention, net revenue retention, and we'll talk about board stuff, but those are important assumptions that we're driving through the revenue forecast that get buried. And if you have an astute board, they're going to ask about that. If we're running 90% GRR, Ben, what's your estimate? What's your assumption for 2025? Is it 90? Is it 92? Is it 88? So the subscription momentum report, the MR waterfall, just makes your life so much easier.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there are a couple of mistakes that people can make with this. Like, they'll track ARR or MRR in a waterfall format for like historicals, but like in their model, there's a revenue line. It's like, no. You need to know the inputs and drivers behind this. And the second thing, and I felt trapped this with actually in a board meeting once, where I had this awesome forecast, ARR waterfall. I knew all the levers and stuff. And then somebody said, well, what's your forecast net dollar retention rate? And it was knowable, but like I just didn't even think at the end of the day to like I should also know that number and what it is in the forecast.
Yeah, and then this is another screenshot of that MR waterfall subscription momentum report. And again, this just really firms up your budget model, your forecast model. So and really when you think about the MR waterfall, there's an assumption for each one, right? That new layer coming in, right? That's driven by our go-to-market process, our pipeline, the expansion, right? There are assumptions around expansion, then contraction. We have assumptions there, and then churn. Each of those require their own assumptions, and if you have that, lay those out. Plus, in the board meeting, also good, to lay that out, because then they know that you've done your homework.
Ben, this is my favorite new term, the 9A plus 3F.
Yeah, I didn't know. I'd love to hear in the comments if other people refer to that way. It's a 9/8. So 9 months of actuals plus 3F. So 1A plus 11F as we close out January. So I don't know. That was just what I used. But tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear it. But again, CJ, you alluded to this earlier, the 3 plus 12, or 3 months of actuals plus 12 of budget next year. This is the foundation where we compare year-over-year variances. So we understand the movement of the budget. So that 9A plus 3F has to be as spot on as possible. If you're going to spend more time on a forecast, that would be the forecast, because that sets those assumptions, the variance analysis, why the budget is moving certain ways. And I've found, I don't know if you've had this, CJ, but I've done this as an analyst, where we just had some crazy stuff flowing through our forecast. And then when I try to explain those variances year over year, I just can't explain. I'm like, something is wrong with the forecast. So it's just, good hygiene. We have a nice clean forecast process that then it just makes those and the year over year stuff easier.
Yeah, all reforecasting is important, but this reforecasting at the end of the year is the most important, because you don't want to be sitting there in late November like I have this gap that I got to make up for next year. because ARR isn't going to come in where I want it. And like, I believe that you shouldn't like change. Ben, you'll have to give me your opinion. I believe you shouldn't change the budget at the end of the year based on where you came out. So like if you're $1 million positive in ARR, great. The total goal for the next year is better. But if you're $1 million less, like, no, that you should have forecasted it a little bit better. And unfortunately, you're going to be starting a bit behind the 8 ball.
Yeah, for me, once once the budget is set, like it's set, if it's approved, or the 9A plus 3F, unless there's a global pandemic, which maybe then we can do a little bit of a reset and change things. But yeah, that question comes up. Next year we're forecasting again, but we don't change the budget.
Somebody, Christopher B, we call it the Q4 commit. We're committing to a forecast that takes us to the end of the year and is the basis for the next FY planning.
Yep. Yeah, you need that commit, especially from your sales leader.
Yeah. Ben, what are some of the guardrails that you set in this roll-up?
So now, rolling up the budget, again, looking at those year-over-year variances, what we're seeing. And there's one thing that I see over and over is what I call the growth trap. Like, ARR is going higher, revenue is going higher, gross profit is scaling, all that stuff, but we land back at that same EBITDA margin, right? And we know, especially if we're in the PE world, we want better EBITDA margins, EBITDA growth. And I call it the growth trap, right? It's just we're just spinning our wheels. So again, that gets back to our priorities. What are we trying to achieve? Because that colors my perspective. A lot of times, like as a CFO, I need that context, that perspective. I can look at the numbers at face value, but that perspective, like you said, CJ, what are our priorities? What are our goals? That then helps me determine, like, is this budget achieving what we're trying to achieve? So I'd say a lot of like CFO variance analysis, year over year stuff, just to see, is it moving in the right direction, achieving what we're trying to hit next year?
And at the end of the day, I'm comparing, did what I roll up, how close is it to the tops down that we started this, right? Like, is there a massive gap where we just totally off? Did we not have an understanding of like what the basically the capacity of the sales engine could produce for next year? That's kind of the come to Jesus moment that sometimes you have, but hopefully you're pretty close. What I typically find is that the revenue is a little bit lighter than I wanted in the tops down and the costs are a little heavier. Someone asked a question. How do you approach commission expense estimates? Do you have comp plans done before you finalize budget? My assumption is tracking about 7% short this year as the trends on kickers and accelerators become clear. Wishing comp plans were done in November. Ooh.
Yeah, that's, commissions, that's a big deal. That's where you can have a big miss, unfortunately. So yeah, ideally, while we're doing budget season, our CRO VP of sales is also working on those commissions plans. So we know how to budget commissions. And sometimes we don't, right? Sometimes we were in January and they still haven't locked down those commissions plans. And that's going to be hard, right? Then we could have variances. There's not much we can do there. When I look at budgets and commissions, I like to look at weighted averages as a percent of ARR. What revenue streams are we paying out on? Just, I'm still grounding the budget in historical trends. That helps me, and with this, maybe that could help me with that. But yeah, if they change the comp plan, I could get stuck on that one.
Mostlymetrics.com, I wrote a guide on sales rep commissions. And so I went out to a bunch of CFOs and asked, what's your total commission rate, like the total stack, fully burdened? And then also, what are you paying to the individual reps? And so what I found is that it's a reflection, and you should, decide this as a company. It's a reflection of how many resources you have and mouths to feed that go into each deal. And also what the expected retention rate of your customer is going to be and the gross margin on your product. Those three variables should determine, is this like a 20% total commission stack and 10% is going to the rep, or is this a 12% commission stack and 4% is going to the rep? So you have to look at it across those three vectors. Getting budget approval. Dun, dun, dun. Template wise, I think that you should know what your board wants to see and what they'll react, like be able to absorb pretty quickly. The problem that I see people go through is that they just went through months and months and months of work, and then they try to go in and like blind the board with science and show them like too minute of details. So you should know it. You should have it in the back of your head. You should be able to tell them what drove all the assumptions, but you should be able to tell them, look, if you remember this long-term plan that we've taken you through in the past, this is where we're coming out to. It's pretty close to that. And, here are the main financial goals that we have behind it. Ben, how do you go about getting approval at the end of this?
Yeah, I think right. Yeah. Again, we have to allow us enough time. I'd say at least 2 weeks to prepare those budget slides. Unfortunately, whether we like that or not, because it takes a ton of time to do a good presentation. And I think for me, it's always starting high, right? Bookings targets. How are we trending this year? What are we forecasting our budget next year? And maybe by product line to give them just a level set. What are those big movements in our budget year over year? Then maybe it's the P&L, the balance sheet, changes in revenue year over year, gross profit, EBITDA. Then I go through revenue assumptions. So those big revenue assumptions we talked about, retention, GR, NRR, things like that, the mix between new versus existing. And then I get down, and we don't go through it in detail, but then I also have department slides. So for each department, how are expenses moving year over year? What are those big changes? What are the headcount changes? So kind of starting really high level so they can get that feel of how the budget's moving, and then go into the detail if needed.
Yeah, and I like to actually put a slide in there that lays out the themes, the financial themes for next year. So, for example, we strive to add $10 million in net ARR additions. We want to have ARR per head above 150,000 per person. We want our gross margin to exceed 80%. And then you can kind of frame it like you're going down a P&L too, so it's logical. And then at the end, we want to be cash flow break even by June, something like that. And so when you tell a story with it, because remember, it's numbers, but you want to distill it and bring it back up to a story. You want to tell a story of where you're going next year and how it plays into the long-term success of the company. Then what I like to do is I do a plan on a page, which is like the key metrics, because it may not just be like a financial statement that they want to see. They want to see ARR, they want to see burn multiple, net dollar retention. And then what I try to do is show actually like the P&L by quarter. So you can templatize it. I have some on mostlymetrics.com, but each person does it a bit different. And it's kind of like training your board to absorb the information you're getting. So it makes your life easier of when they finally approve it.
Yeah, definitely.
What's required by January 1st? This is like the drop dead date, Ben.
Well, ideally, right? I mean, I've had we're still in January trying to just tweak a few things that the board wanted, but yeah, ideally it's wrapped up, it's loaded. We give those department budgets back to the leaders so they know what to execute again. Like the sales comp is done, it's signed. Recruiting, right? That's a big thing, right? We forget
huge,
and people, right? They need to know at the end of budget season. All right, what kind of workload do I have upcoming here? Who am I recruiting for? So getting them, they're a key piece of this process as well.
Yeah, and a lot of times you're still building some sales capacity throughout the year, right? Like it's not like you have everyone on board to hit your Q3 or Q4 goal. If you don't give those assignments to the recruiting team, you're not going to fill them. So make sure you include the recruiting team because they have limited capacity too. And a lot of companies do a sales kickoff. Maybe it's in late January, maybe early February. You do not want to send reps to sales kickoff without quota goals or commission plans.
No. Hard to have a sales kickoff.
Yeah, it's an awkward one. Ben, anything we didn't cover or should hit on before we open it up for any remaining questions here?
Yeah, boy, we covered a lot here. I think, make sure you communicate that timeline, get everybody on board, of what we're trying to achieve this budget season, because if we don't, it could be very difficult. But we covered a ton here, CJ. So I'd love to take some Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. What do we got?
We have Sean talking about deferred revenue. Would deferred revenue be the tool to amortize revenue? So absolutely right. When we close the books, we've got to reconcile our deferred revenue subledger, make sure that ties out. And that gets to revenue forecasting and revenue budgeting. Are we invoicing annually? Are we invoicing monthly? Are they paying by credit card? Are they paying manually? That dictates what's the ARR balance? How is our deferred revenue building? If you're doing a full 3-statement forecast budget, you've got to consider deferred revenue, annual invoicing, monthly invoicing, all that stuff, so you get cash flow right.
Yeah, and I like that we brought this up because that's one of those things that makes your life easier. It's like a known item that you can put into the forecast, so it's not like you're just taking revenue out of thin air. There is something that you know in the budget to put in.
And then maybe CJ Joyce had a question if you want to take it. If you report year over year monthly, oh, she's just saying it helps budget or
Yeah.
forecast the other timing
She
as
did
well.
ask another. Do you prepare monthly dashboard for ELT and board comparing
Mm,
actual versus budget? Who? I create one for the CEO because it has every department in it. I think what we try to do is what we did last year. We went through this exercise where we voted on not we went through and decided on what our North Star metric was, and then we all debated what the top 10 metrics we should track as a company are. And then we created a dashboard for that. And it wasn't as specific, Joyce, as like engineering was 3% over their cost budget. Like we wouldn't want to punch somebody in the nose publicly like that. But what it did have are things like net dollar retention rate, ARR ads, and those all tied back to the, 3 to 5 key metrics that we'd set goals for at the C-suite level. And you could check that at any point throughout the year.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I had my monthly financial package, certain metrics, actual budget, year to date versus budget, department level stuff, and a whole host of other things that we produce monthly to review. Then I'd review with the executive leadership team, and then depending on your board and who that is or private equity, then we had a quick monthly board meeting, really focused on sales and finance versus say that full quarterly meeting. But yeah, definitely I had about a 20-30 page financial pack each month.
Yeah, it just gets longer, right? I think
Mhm.
at one point I had like 12 different cuts of renewal metrics or
Mhm.
retention metrics. And then somebody once said, like, this is too many. I was like, you guys are the ones who asked for all these. I just kept adding them.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you do have to come up with what's your investor package and then what's your internal package. And those metrics won't always be the same, right? Because a lot of times investors will ask for increasingly compound metrics, like an LTV to CAC metric or something. Like within the org day to day, that's probably pretty hard to change, but it is something that your investors are going to ask for. So you have to be ready.
Yeah. And this is a good one, CJ. From Gregory? What are the best ways to establish accountability with the department leaders?
I think first you have to figure out like what level of maturity you are just with having budgets. So I've been at orgs where literally no one had owned a budget before, right? So I can't come in and expect them to understand what I'm talking about fully. I have to go a bit slower, and B, have to be a bit more lenient and explain slower at the end of each month what's going on. But if you're at like an org that's say over 100 million in revenue, like everyone there should have ran a budget before. And it probably does come back to having those priorities clearly laid out. And the priorities, like I said, it gets the whole org on the same page of what you're allocating resources to and what you're saying no to. How have you dealt with this, Ben?
Yeah, there can be a lot of politics at play depending on the size of your company, but yeah, I think that's where the department leaders own the budget, right? You're helping them craft that, but at the end of the day, they have to own it. It has to be their inputs. They have to understand it. Again, that's that level of education. Have they been through 20 budgets, or is this their first budget? And then, again, the accountability is actual the budget. That's why variance analysis is so powerful to see where are we ahead, where are we behind. And maybe you need just a session with that department leader, just going through that, so because yeah, like CJ said, we don't want to throw them under the bus when we get to that ELT meeting. So yeah, that actual to budget, understanding that, making sure they understand it, and again, being proactive with that. It's not just doing variance analysis to do variance analysis, but if we're behind, how do we recover? Do we have to pull budget from elsewhere? If we're ahead, all right, let's keep going. But it's it depends on education and how experienced they are with the budget.
Ben, what templates or tools do you use in order to reduce the friction with department heads in order for them to get the finance team what it needs?
Yeah, so it depends. Like I've done Excel based, I've done FP&A software based, but usually what I have, and I think we'll share it after the webinar. I have two templates that I like to use that I send to my department leaders. One, again, this gets to I don't need every single expense running through your department, but I need to know where do you want to invest, what's going to change that discretionary spend, what people do you need to hire, etc. So I send them a template where they fill out their headcount needs, short justifications, the non-wage expenses, what do they need there? Say, for example, do they need training, consulting, and also that travel template? So I give that to each department leader. I get that draft back. I'm working on the revenue side with my go-to-market leader. and then I have all the inputs that I need to create that first draft.
Ben, to your point, it's collecting a lot of the net new things. So half of it, Benjamin, is you're sharing the stuff that you want to give them for context, and the other half is making it easy for them to give you information in a format that you can then absorb and then roll back up. I've done it the right way. I've done it the wrong way before. I've gone overboard with information shared. I have templates as well that I just wrote a series on, and I've found that it's the right level of information for then you to roll back up into the budget. I think we got time for maybe one more question here.
Yeah, almost out of time here. So if there's one more or one we missed. Yeah, Usha has a question about SaaS companies getting some additional dollars in their budget for AI related expenses. So I've been on a lot of webinars lately with AI and FP&A, finance, and all that, and I just talked about this week where from my CFO perspective in AI, it's just like any other tool. Like we've got to justify it. We're not just going to do it just because it's AI. So it's going to follow that normal justification process, and also AI is our say the current vendor, are they going to incorporate AI? Do we need to get a new solution because we need AI? So I think it's going to follow your usual justification process.
Yeah, I like to say that the P&L doesn't discriminate. It still wants at scale 25% EBITDA margins, and so if there isn't a different budget now that you want to incorporate AI, unfortunately. So if anything, it should be, well, what's the corresponding increase in revenue or efficiency we get out of it? So it's all the math equation at the end of the day, puts and takes.
Yeah, definitely.
Ben, that was a lot of fun. I'm glad Maxio asked us to do this and team up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I put my, if any further questions, contact me at thesaascfo.com. Yeah, CJ, this was a lot of fun. Budget season's coming up. So hopefully you have some thoughts about, framing up a good budget season.
Absolutely. And check out Ben's stuff. It's killer. I've used your templates for years. So glad to finally do one of these with you, buddy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks, Anthony, Benjamin. Appreciate everybody. I know time's valuable, so appreciate that. So thanks, Aaron, Chad, Joyce. Yeah, hopefully we can do this again in the future then. Thanks, Tom. All right. Well, I think with that, we're going to call it a wrap and get back to our
everybody.
metrics.
Yeah, back to budgeting. See ya.